May Vern, 1898, the dim light of dawn at Manila Bay, Philippines. Just as the soldiers of the Spanish naval fleet were beginning their day's preparations, a new power appeared on the horizon, the American Asiatic Squadron. Led by Commodore George Dewey, the modern steel U.S. warships were leagues ahead of the Spanish wooden ships. Within a few hours, the symbol of Spain's 3 centuries of colonial power. Their fleet was torn apart by Dewey's cannon fire and sank into the depths of the bay. Thousands of Filipinos watched this scene from the Manila coast. In their eyes and faces, there was no fear, but hope. To the Filipinos, tired of the long, bloody revolution against Spanish rule, this American arrival was a message of liberation. They thought democracy-worshipping America had come to fight against tyrannical Spain to make their dream of independence come true. The Americans had brought the exiled leader of the Filipino Revolution, Emilio Aguinaldo, back from Hong Kong on their own ship, which further strengthened that belief. But history is a cruel irony. The Filipinos, who thought of the Americans as liberator friends, fighting shoulder to shoulder, within just a few months, had to enter another bloody war for independence against those very Americans. The dream of independence they had almost touched was snatched away by a new, more powerful colonial force. How did the Filipino dream of independence turn into a new colonial nightmare? Why did the America that extended a hand of friendship become the new master? And why did America, appearing as a liberator, transform into a colonial power itself? We will try to find the answers to these complex and controversial questions in today's episode from start to finish. To understand the context of America's arrival in the Philippines, we must go back about 333 years. Europeans arrived in the Philippines through Ferdinand Magellan in 1521, and from 1565, Spain turned this archipelago into their colony. This long 3 centuries of Spanish rule depended mainly on 2 important things: religion and economy. The Roman Catholic Church was the main tool of Spanish rule. Spanish friars or priests didn't just preach religion, they were the most powerful individuals. From education and culture to daily life, everything was controlled through the church. On the other hand, economic exploitation was ruthless. Through the Galleon Trade, Philippine wealth was smuggled to Spain via Mexico. The owners of huge lands or haciendas were Spanish aristocrats and the church, where Filipino farmers effectively turned into serfs. But towards the end of the 19th century, resistance began to form against this exploitative system. A group of young Filipino intellectuals educated in Europe, known as Ilustrados, or the Enlightened Ones, started raising demands for reform. The brightest star among them was Jose Rizal. Rizal did not call for an armed revolution. His weapon was the pen. His 2 famous novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, presented a living picture of the corruption, hypocrisy, and cruelty of Spanish colonial rule, which ignited the fire of nationalism among Filipinos. Spanish authorities identified Rizal as a rebel and executed him by firing squad on December 30th, 1896. But this killing, instead of extinguishing the fire of revolution, fueled it further. Failing to see hope in Rizal's path of reform, ordinary Filipinos chose a more extremist path. In 1892, a secret revolutionary organization named Katipunan was formed under the leadership of Andres Bonifacio. Their goal was to achieve full independence from Spain through armed struggle. When the existence of the Katipunan was leaked in 1896, a revolution began across the country. Through this revolution rose a young and charismatic leader named Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo quickly gained recognition as a successful military commander and came to lead the revolutionary government. However, due to internal conflicts, Bonifacio was controversially executed, which remains a dark chapter in the history of the Filipino Revolution. Although the revolutionaries fought like heroes, they gradually became weak in front of the well-organized Spanish army. Finally, in 1897, through a truce called the Pact of Biak-na-Bato, Aguinaldo and his companions agreed to go into exile in Hong Kong. Although this exile was a temporary strategy, the Filipino desire for independence was still intensely alive. And right at this time, events were happening in the Caribbean islands that were about to change the fate of the Philippines forever. In the 1890s, a bloody struggle for independence was going on in Cuba, another Spanish colony. American newspapers, especially the yellow journalism of William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, were printing exaggerated stories of Spanish barbarism in Cuba, creating intense anti-Spain sentiment among the American public. Amidst this tension, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. warship USS Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor, sank in a mysterious explosion, killing 266 American sailors. Although the cause of the explosion is still unknown today, American media blamed Spain without any proof and created war hysteria, raising the slogan, "Remember the Maine." Leaders of America's then imperialist mindset utilized this opportunity. Influential figures like Theodore Roosevelt, who believed in Alfred Thayer Mahan's naval power theory, had long been looking for an American naval base in Asia and a gateway to enter China's huge market. The Philippines was the perfect place for that geopolitical strategy. As soon as the possibility of war appeared, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt ordered Commodore George Dewey to be ready in Hong Kong with his Asiatic squadron. His secret order was to destroy the Spanish fleet in the Philippines as soon as war began with Spain. On April 25, 1898, America declared war against Spain. Just 6 days later, on May the 1st, Dewey entered Manila Bay with his force and completely destroyed the Spanish fleet. This victory was so fast and one-sided that only one American sailor died, and that was from heat stroke. But Dewey had a big problem. Although he controlled the sea, he didn't have enough ground troops to capture Manila City. Here he needed the Filipino revolutionaries. Dewey established contact with Emilio Aguinaldo, exiled in Hong Kong. Several meetings were held with Aguinaldo through American consuls. There is debate about exactly what was discussed in these meetings. Aguinaldo and his companions claimed that the Americans gave them verbal promises regarding Philippine independence. On the other hand, Americans always avoided giving any written promise. They used Aguinaldo's desire for independence, but did not bind themselves to any formal agreement. Trusting this vague promise, Aguinaldo returned to the Philippines on an American ship on May 19, 1898. His return infused new life into the Filipino revolutionaries. With American-supplied weapons and the aid of Dewey's naval blockade, Aguinaldo's forces took control of most of the Philippines, including the entire island of Luzon, with incredible speed. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared the independence of the Philippines, and the Filipino people hoisted their own flag for the first time. It seemed that the establishment of an independent Filipino republic was only a matter of time. When Filipino revolutionaries were liberating city after city from the Spanish, they firmly believed the Americans were their allies. But behind the scenes, a completely different game was being played. American generals and policymakers in Washington never saw Filipinos as equal partners. In their eyes, Filipinos were merely a convenient tool to establish American rule in place of Spanish rule. The most shameless expression of this attitude occurred during the capture of Manila on August 13, 1898. Aguinaldo's forces had surrounded Manila from all sides, and the fall of the city was inevitable. But the Spanish governor could not accept the indignity of surrendering to the so-called uncivilized Filipinos. So Spanish and American commanders secretly made a pact. According to the agreement, a mock battle would be held. Americans would shell for a while, and then the Spanish would formally surrender to the Americans, not the Filipinos. According to this secret agreement, American soldiers entered the city while Aguinaldo's forces were kept outside. They were forbidden from entering their own capital city, for whose liberation they had shed blood. This was the first clear betrayal, and at the same time, it sowed the seeds of suspicion in the minds of Filipino leaders. But the actual theft or snatching happened a few months later, thousands of miles away in Paris. In December 1898, delegates met in Paris for peace talks between Spain and America. The fate of the Philippines was being decided in these talks, but no Filipino representative was invited there. Aguinaldo had sent a representative, but he wasn't even allowed near the discussions. The main topic of discussion was what America would do with the Philippines. Spain had lost the war and had no power to keep their colonies. There was intense disagreement within the American delegation as well. A fierce debate between imperialism versus anti-imperialism was going on inside America. Leading the imperialists were President William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and Senator Albert Beveridge. Their argument was that the Philippines would be an important base for American trade in Asia, especially for entering China's huge market. Moreover, if America let go of the Philippines, some other colonial power like Germany or Japan would seize it, which would be strategically harmful to America. Then there was the white man's burden, a racist and paternalistic concept. According to them, Filipinos were little brown brothers who were unfit and uncivilized to rule themselves. Therefore, it was a holy duty of Americans to civilize, educate, and Christianize them. Although Filipinos had been followers of the Catholic Christian religion for 300 years, President McKinley later claimed that while praying on his knees, he received divine instruction from God to take the Philippines. On the other hand, influential figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and William Jennings Bryan formed the Anti-Imperialist League and fiercely opposed this. Their argument was that ruling the people of another country without their consent was contrary to the principles of America's Declaration of Independence. It was hypocrisy and tyranny. But in the end, the imperialists won. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. According to this treaty, Spain handed over the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to America in exchange for $20 million, meaning the country that had effectively been liberated by Filipino revolutionaries was sold by one colonial master to another for money without the knowledge of its people. From the Filipinos' perspective, this was a cold-blooded betrayal and a shameless theft of their hard-earned independence. As soon as the news of the Paris Treaty reached the Philippines, President McKinley announced the policy of benevolent assimilation, stating that America had come to the Philippines to help, not to rule. But to the Filipinos, this was merely a sweet coating on colonial rule. They wanted independence, not a new master. Around Manila, the two armies pointed guns at each other, creating an explosive situation. That explosion occurred on the night of February 4, 1899. While crossing the Santa Mesa Bridge in Manila, an American sentry named Private William Grayson shot and killed a Filipino soldier. This single incident was the spark of war. American commanders used this as an excuse for a planned Filipino attack and launched an all-out attack on Filipino positions the next morning. The Philippine-American War began. The Americans thought this would be a short and easy war, but they were wrong. This war was many times longer, bloodier, and crueler than the Spanish-American War. The war can be divided into two phases. The first phase was conventional war. Aguinaldo's newly formed Philippine Republic Army fought with courage. Their most capable commander was General Antonio Luna, a European-trained and hot-tempered military genius. Luna built several successful resistances against the Americans, but due to his strict discipline and opposition to political interference, he created enemies within the Filipino leadership. In June 1899, Luna was conspiratorially and brutally assassinated. It is assumed that Aguinaldo gave tacit consent to this assassination. Luna's death was the biggest blow to the Filipinos' conventional war. In front of the well-organized and technologically advanced American army, Filipinos were forced to retreat, and by November 1899, their conventional army was almost destroyed. Then began the second and more terrible phase of the war: guerrilla warfare. Aguinaldo ordered his forces to split into small groups and spread into villages and jungles. Filipino guerrillas launched surprise attacks to sever American supply lines, and then continued the war by blending in with the general population. In response to this guerrilla war, the American army adopted tactics that surpassed even Spanish barbarism. The same reconcentration camp or concentration camp policy for which Americans had called Spain uncivilized, they started applying themselves. Village after village was burned down. Ordinary people were evicted from their homes and kept in unhygienic camps so they could not help the guerrillas. Thousands of civilians died of disease and starvation in these camps. Ruthless torture was used to extract information from prisoners. Among these, the most notorious was a method called the water cure, where they tried to extract information by nearly drowning the prisoner. In places like Samar Island, General Jacob Smith ordered his soldiers to kill all males over 10 years old, which amounted to genocide. This war also poisoned the mentality of American soldiers. They often did not regard Filipinos as human, which further increased their brutality. This undeclared war continued until 1902, although resistance in some regions continued for another decade. In 1901, in a daring operation led by General Frederick Funston, Aguinaldo was strategically captured. Afterward, Aguinaldo took an oath of allegiance to American rule and called on his companions to surrender, which was the final nail in the coffin of organized resistance. About 4,200 American soldiers died in this war. On the other hand, the extent of Filipino losses was horrifying. About 20,000 soldiers and between 200,000 to 1,000 civilians died from war, famine, and disease. This was an extremely painful chapter in the history of the Philippines. Alongside the brutality of war, America tried to present their colonial rule in the Philippines as a civilizing mission. The name of this policy was benevolent assimilation. Its main objective was to make Filipinos educated and modern in the American mold and prepare them for self-rule. Under this policy, Americans brought about some institutional changes in the Philippines that deeply influenced the country's future. The most significant and positive aspect of this rule was the introduction of a public education system. In 1901, about 500 American teachers, known as Thomasites, arrived in the Philippines by ship and built a nationwide public school system. But English was made mandatory as the medium of instruction, which at the same time cornered the local language and culture of the Philippines to some extent. Americans brought massive improvements in health and sanitation systems. Through hospital construction, vaccination programs, and public health laws, the outbreak of cholera, smallpox, and other diseases decreased dramatically. Communication between different islands was improved by building infrastructure like roads, bridges, and ports. Politically, Americans gradually started including Filipinos in the process of self-rule. An elected Philippine Assembly was formed, and the judicial system was reconstructed on the model of the American model. But there was a dark side to this benevolent rule. Economically, the Philippine market was opened up for American corporations. The country's natural resources, especially sugar, coconut, and tobacco were used as raw materials for American factories, which made the Philippines economically completely dependent on America. Politically, Americans shook hands with the elite class, or ilustrados, of Filipino society. This wealthy and educated class maintained their privileges under American rule, and their distance from ordinary people increased further. As a result, even after colonial rule ended, the country's wealth and power remained in the hands of a few families, which is still a major social problem in the Philippines today. However, the desire for independence was never erased from the minds of Filipinos. Even under American rule, they continued to bargain peacefully for independence. After the Jones Act of 1916, the Philippines was given a formal promise of independence in the near future for the first time. Finally, through the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, a timeline was set to give the Philippines full independence after a 10-year Commonwealth period. But when Japan occupied the Philippines during World War II, this process was delayed. After the war, according to the agreement, on July 4, 1946, America officially granted independence to the Philippines. The independence that could have been achieved in 1898, Filipinos had to wait almost another half-century to get, and had to endure the horrors of another world war. So, did America steal the Philippines? From the perspective of Filipinos, the answer is almost undoubtedly yes. They had reached the doorstep of independence by ending Spanish rule. Americans came as allies, snatched away that victory, and imposed a new and crueler colonial rule. The Treaty of Paris was a legal cover through which a nation's right to self-determination was bought for $20 million. America's motives were complex. Among them were economic greed, geopolitical ambition, and a diluted concept of racist superiority like the white man's burden. Although they saw themselves as liberators, their actions were like that of an imperialist. The Philippine-American War is a forgotten chapter in American history because it directly conflicts with the principles of their own Declaration of Independence. But for the Philippines, it is a deep national trauma, which taught them that in international politics, the dream of freedom of weak nations often becomes trivial to the national interests of powerful countries. This history of betrayal sowed the seeds of the complex relationship between the Philippines and America.